Here we are at the Air Zoo Museum in Portage, Michigan, and this place is incredible. I didn't even know this place existed, but it is amazing. It tells the story of air travel from the very beginning, from Wilbur and Orville Wright all the way to the latest jet crafts, and it is incredibly well done. Now, one of the things that is unmistakable when you come to a place like this is how air travel and warfare are intertwined, that literally one has driven the other. The idea of war has driven the development of air travel. It's really an incredible thing. And the idea of warfare is a big deal, right? It determines history. History is determined by the winners of war, and freedom is determined by the winner of wars. Even your freedom and my freedom as Americans has been largely determined by the winning of war. And the idea of freedom, it's not just an idea, it is something that is tangible, something that had to be paid for. It comes with a very, very high cost. As a matter of fact, there is this old saying out there that says, freedom isn't cheap. That freedom has to be pursued, that freedom has to be protected, freedom has to be sought after, and it has to be preserved from one generation to the next. And I think that's really true. And so this first week of the March series, we're talking about this idea of freedom. We're talking about the idea that God has created us to have a soul that is free. Now, when you start to talk about freedom as Americans, you think back of the men and women who sacrificed so much so that you and I can be free. And we are grateful for that. But not everyone has been free in our country. When we think back in our own history, we have a very sordid past when it comes to freedom. We think back in our nation to the days of slavery, and it's unbelievable that we have this as part of our history, as part of our story. There was a time just a couple hundred years ago that in our nation, that if you were a black person, that you were only considered to be 3/5 human. I want you to think about that. 3/5 human. That is shameful and that is evil. There was a point in our nation's history where we used to believe that one man could own another man. How crazy is that? That one person could dominate over another person. This idea of slavery has been a terrible scourge on our nation's history. As a matter of fact, you think about the idea of slavery. To be a slave meant that you were dominated by another human being. Your owner, your master, if you will, they would dictate every part of your life, from when you got up in the morning to where you worked and how hard you worked. No matter how brutal it was, they owned you. They told you what you could eat, what you could not eat, what you could do as far as religion goes. Your education was controlled by another human being. I was reading some stories recently about slavery, and it was literally heartbreaking that many slave owners would actually breed their slaves in order to sell the offspring. How evil is that? How vile is that? That unbelievable. And so when you think about slavery versus freedom, you would choose freedom any day. When you contrast the two, there is no comparison. All of us want to be free. But the question that we've been wrestling with is, are you really free? Is there a different kind of freedom, and is there a different kind of slavery that we wrestle with on the inside? I think there is. As a matter of fact, there is this old singer, songwriter, kind of hippie guy named Bob Dylan, and he has kind of a crazy voice, but he once wrote a song that I think carried a ton of truth, and he said it like this. He says, you gotta serve somebody. You gotta serve somebody. It might be the devil or it might be the Lord, but you gotta serve somebody. And there is truth to this, right? That you do have to serve somebody, that you do serve someone or something. We begin to talk about this idea that you serve what controls you. You serve what dominates you. You serve the thoughts that dictate the direction of your life. You serve the habits. You're a slave to the habits that literally control who you are. You're a slave to this master called addiction that determines what you're going to do day in and day out in your life. And so this idea of soul freedom is very different. And this is the essence of the Christian faith, right? That our soul can be free, that our soul does not have to remain a slave. And the truth is, there is this thing called soul slavery. There is a spiritual slavery that you and I wrestle with every single day. As a matter of fact, the Apostle Paul, the writer that God used for most of the New Testament part of the Bible, he understood a thing or two about spiritual slavery. And he writes to the people of Rome, the Christians that were coming out of the heart of the Roman Empire in the city of Rome. And he writes to them this letter about slavery. And he says it like this. He says, everybody is a slave to something. He begins with these words in the 6th chapter. He says, do you not realize that you have become a slave to whatever you choose to obey? You can be a slave to sin, which leads to death, or you can choose to obey God, which leads to righteous living. Now, I want you to think about this. This is an amazing little passage. Paul says that you can choose to be a slave. How crazy is that? Who chooses to be a slave? But he says, no. You do choose your slavery. In other words, you're going to serve somebody. You're going to serve something. So you might as well choose the right thing. And so when we think of American history, you're right. We don't think of slavery as something anybody chose, that it was forced upon them. And that is absolutely the truth. It was heinous and it was evil. It was forced upon them. But when Paul wrote to the people at Rome, they understood slavery a little bit differently. In ancient days, if we were to travel way back to the time of Rome when this book was written, they understood slavery differently because there were different forms of slavery. Most certainly in Rome, there were the conquered people, right? Where Rome would come in and conquer a people group and they would utterly enslave them. They would brutalize them and turn them into slaves. But what's interesting is Rome understood that they could not develop an empire simply by slavery. They had to have citizens. And so they had to have a pathway for slaves to become citizens, or for those that were conquered to become citizens of Rome, because you can't have an empire simply built out of slavery. You have to have citizens that support you, citizens that pay taxes, citizens that build a society together. And so Rome was very clever about this. They developed this understanding that you could use your slavery as a pathway to citizenship. If you served for so long and if you served with excellence, you could literally earn your way to freedom. So the people had a different understanding of slavery. As a matter of fact, this is bizarre almost to think about this, but when Paul wrote this to the city of Rome, historians think about 2/3 of the entire population of the Roman Empire that centered around the city of Rome were slaves of some kind. Now, we would call these people indentured servants. They had an understanding that they would serve so many years and then gain their citizenship. They would gain their freedom. So Paul begins to write, you got to choose who you're going to serve. Who are you going to be a slave to? And so, as a matter of fact, he writes this out extensively in Romans chapter 6. Now, here's what we're going to do. Now, we're going to go old school on you a little bit, and I'm going to read an entire section of the Bible to you, just like a whole part of a chapter to you, and I want you to think about this, and then a little bit later in your group, you're going to discuss this, but this is an incredible little passage. Listen to this. It's Romans chapter 6, and I'm going to begin in verse 6. It says, "For we know that our old sinful selves were crucified with Christ so that sin might lose its power in our lives. We are no longer slaves of sin." And you see what he's saying? He's saying that when we come to Christ, as we grow in our relationship with Christ, the power of sin, the slavery of sin becomes less and less. We find a growing freedom in our soul. And then it says this, for when we died with Christ, we were set free from the power of sin. And since we died with Christ, we know that we will also live with him. We are sure of this because Christ was raised from the dead and he will never die again. Death, listen to this. It says, death no longer has any power over him. When he died once to break the power of sin. But now that he lives for the glory of God, so that you should also consider yourselves dead to the power of sin and alive to God through Christ Jesus. You hear what he's saying? He is saying because what happened with Christ, with his death, his resurrection, his dominance over sin, you and I, because we have the power of Christ living in us, because his spirit lives in us, we too can be free from sin. We can move forward in our life. We don't have to stay where we are. It is no longer the master over us. Now check this out. He goes on to say, do not let sin control the way that you live. Pause. Do not let sin control the way that you live. This is where we could get really honest. If we're truthful, I think a whole bunch of us, me included, have sin that dominates us, that we allow to control us. And part of us says, oh, I don't really want that. But there's another part of us that's comfortable with that sin. And God says that needs to be wrestled to the ground. Something has to change with that, because the purpose of Christ coming is so that we would literally be free from the sin that controls us and the sin that ensnares us and keeps us down. Now check this out. He goes on to say, so do not let sin control the way that you live. Do not give in to your sinful desires. Do not let any part of your body become an instrument for evil to serve sin. Whew. That's some strong stuff. Don't let it control you. Don't go using your body, your hands, your mind, your eyes, your ears to encourage sin of any kind in your life. It will separate you from God. It says this. It says, give yourselves, here's the answer, give yourselves completely to God, for you were dead. For you were a slave, you were dead, but now you have new life. So use your whole body as an instrument to do what is right for the glory of God. Sin is no longer, here it is, no longer your master, for you are no longer living under the requirements of the law of sin. Instead, you live under the freedom of God's grace. That's good news, right? It says that we can make a choice, that we can choose a different direction in our life. That God's grace can change us, that God's grace can grow us. And here's how he ends this section. He says this, well then, since God's grace has set us free from the law, does that mean that we can go on sinning? In other words, can you just keep doing what you're doing because you become a Christian and God will forgive you? He says, absolutely not. He says, of course not. Don't you realize that you become the slave of whatever you choose to obey? You can be a slave to sin, which leads to death, or you can choose to obey God, which leads to righteousness. Then he says this, thank God. Once you were slaves of sin, but now you wholeheartedly obey the teachings we have given you about Jesus, right? Now you are free from your slavery to sin and you have become slaves to righteousness. Now that's incredible. God's grace is at the center of our Christian experience. God's goodness to move us away from one master to a new master. But Bob Dylan was right. You got to choose to serve somebody. You're going to serve somebody. It might be the devil or it might be the Lord, but you've got to choose who you're going to serve. So literally, slavery still exists. It's a spiritual slavery, and it's a slavery of choice. We got to make this choice to choose who we're going to serve. When I reflect on my own spiritual journey, I used to think, you know what, I get it. Other people are slaves. They're addicted. They're struggling with this or that. But that wasn't my story. My story is that I came out of of a good home, a Christian home. My parents loved me and they created a good environment for us. And I was a good kid. I didn't get involved with drugs or drinking or running around with women or any of that stuff. It was a different story for me. So when I would read about this idea of slavery, or when I would go to church and they would talk about this sin that would control people, I would think, yeah, it's other people. It's them. They got the problem. I used to never think it was for me. It wasn't about me until I started to read and understand the scripture for myself. And I understood that my slavery was different than other people's slavery, but it was still slavery. You know what I think my slavery was, if I'm going to be honest with you? For me, it's a slave of self-righteousness. I think that God saved me from my own pious self. I used to think, looking at other people like, man, they're screwed up and I don't do all those things. And yet I would have this condemning heart toward them. And yet I did not realize that my sin was a sin of self-righteousness, that I thought I could somehow earn my way to God, that I was somehow good, and that God deserved me, that somehow I was better than everybody else. And if God, if God thought, had the scale of goodness out there, I was so good that he would make me captain of his team or something. And truth is that that's ugly before God. That's just as sinful as the guy who is strung out on heroin, or just as enslaved as the guy who is, a slave to his sexual desires. It's the same thing. That sin destroys the heart. Self-righteousness destroys the heart, and it was destroying my heart. And I came to realize what Isaiah said is true. The great prophet says this. He says that our sin is as filthy rags before God, that our very best deeds that we have, it's like unrighteousness before God. And friends, I just wonder, have you ever come to the point where you realize that your slavery to sin is keeping you from the freedom that God wants you to have? Have you ever rested in the grace and the goodness of God? Have you allowed God's power and God's Spirit to eradicate the dominance of sin in your life? And I know it's not easy. It's this idea of giving more and more of your heart to him. And that's what this whole series is going to be about, is finding freedom through surrendering all that you are to Christ.